You're watching Saturday Anime on the Sci-Fi Channel.
Greetings, this is Reverend Paul, and this, of course, is Raw. Once again, I am joined by Fairlie. Fairlie, how you doing?
I'm okay, how are you?
I've been all right. Today, I thought it would be kind of fun to talk about the basics of a villain.
Okay.
Alrighty, we're gonna do that then. Now, a while back, I made a video on what makes a good hero. And in my video, I said in order to make a good hero, basically you want your hero to have two things. You want them to be relatable and you want them to be admirable. The hero has to be a character that we relate to, that we identify with, that we like, and the hero has to be someone we admire. That's what makes them a hero.
Okay, yeah. I think that last one, so hero, I'm a words person. So hero, I think, is a tricky term because you could have a main character that's relatable and not remotely admirable, and we're still going to watch it because we want to see the story arc play out and maybe even redeem ourselves in the process. But a hero does need that admirable quality to make them truly a hero.
By that same token, a villain could only exist with a hero. There's a difference between a villain and an antagonist. A villain is directly connected to the hero. Going back to Dante's Inferno, the worst sin somebody could commit is betrayal. The lowest level of hell is reserved for the betrayers. Brutus and Judas and Satan, the three biggest betrayers in history. So, I mean, I think that gives us a clue into thinking what makes a good villain, in the sense that our villain needs to be quantumly entangled with our hero. Our villain needs to connect to our hero in some way, whether that be in a literal way where the characters are related, or whether it's in a philosophical way, like Batman and the Joker, where one character represents order and the other character represents chaos. Heroes and villains have to relate to each other, otherwise they don't work.
Yeah, no, I think that there's something to be said for that like foil dynamic, that we do need to see them kind of play off of each other. The villain really needs to be kind of the opposite side of the hero coin. There should be enough common territory that they're not simply out of left field reactive, but that there are lines to be traced, that we can see maybe how those same traits are echoed in a darker way or a more destructive way in an interesting hero-villain dynamic. We could look at it very classically, like mythology is obviously littered with the villain-hero dynamic and things like that, but in the modern context, you really do only see that with more action-adventure, comic book style, like really just explorations of archetype. You're not going to get it from a deeply nuanced like drama, film or something, probably, maybe. Now I'm just thinking about this as like, the villain as kind of like the Jungian shadow of the hero itself, that kind of like underworld journey, but that's a different video entirely.
I think you hit upon something there, because that's something you see a lot in anime, where the villain is just an evil version of the hero. Like in Trigun, Knives is just an evil version of Vash. And Vicious in Cowboy Bebop is pretty much just an evil Spike Spiegel. Akuma is an evil Ryu. And there's literally a character called Evil Ryu.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's where actually like Sailor Moon got really interesting to me, was when you have like Chibiusa becomes like the Dark Lady, and her grown-up expression is a villain fighting her mother. It doesn't really get much more archetypally expressive than that.
Definitely, the Dark Lady was an awesome villain, and the reason is because at the core of that is a daughter betraying the mother, and betrayal is like a common anime theme. It's a fucking meme at this point. And I think you can't talk about betrayal without talking about Griffith from Berserk. I know I talk about it a lot, but the eclipse is one of the great moments in anime, and it is one of the great anime betrayals. Griffith betraying his friends, his family, the Band of the Hawk, and sacrificing them to the God Hand in this epic Inferno-esque sequence. And another thing I think makes Griffith a great villain is the fact that he has a willingness to be excessively cruel. And I think cruelty is the other important trait you want your villain to have. Because evil, in my opinion, is defined as cruelty, or a willingness or a desire to inflict suffering. And that's another thing that really comes across in that eclipse sequence. Griffith's willingness, or desire rather, to make his friends suffer. And it's made even worse by the fact that we have gone on a journey with these characters. We've come to know and love the Band of the Hawk, and now we are watching them them being torn to pieces and being killed in the most brutal ways possible. And I think that's what you can kind of boil evil down to. The willingness and the desire to inflict cruelty and suffering on people, especially when it's your friends.
I think that's a pretty fair assessment. Yeah, I feel like I was having this conversation just recently, actually. In order for us to feel the impact of the evil of the story, we kind of need to feel betrayed in a sense too. And I think that really the only way to do that is to really stray so far from our sense of humanity. Evil, I think, is that abandonment of compassionate humanity, which at its heart is cruelty. Outright unreasonable cruelty is probably going to be the only way to really drive home just how evil a character is. Yeah, I think that's a pretty concise definition.
So I feel like we can kind of boil a villain down to like two things, which is they need to have some kind of connection to the hero and they need to be cruel to the point that they're despicable. And I think that's what separates a villain from an anti-hero. And for some reason, and I didn't realize this was going to be controversial, but when I reviewed Redo of Healer, I described that story as the origin of a villain. But I had a lot of people tell me, no, he's not a villain, he's an anti-hero. But I disagree, because I think what separates an anti-hero from a villain is that an anti-hero is redeemable. Villains are irredeemable. That's why they're villains. And the reason I think the healer in Redo of Healer is a villain and not an anti-hero is because he is going past the point of no return. Like, he has no self-reflection, or he never questions what he's doing, and he's taking sadistic pleasure in torturing people. It's not even killing people. We're talking about taking sadistic pleasure in torturing people and inflicting suffering. And I feel like this character, once you cross the line into sexual assault, you have gone past being an anti-hero.
I can certainly think of anti-heroes that have done some irredeemable things, but I think that for an anti-hero to be an anti-hero and not a villain, that needs to be part of their backstory versus the present motivation. And a villain is cruel. The cruelty is the plot point that you're watching. You're watching this moment unfold, and this dynamic between the villain and the hero is going to involve a good deal of evil deeds. I don't think that you can watch that evil unfold and call it an anti-hero when it inflicts that much irredeemable cruelty on people. I think it was Aristotle who had a whole treatise on theater, and he had some very strong thoughts on what we should be watching and what we should not be watching. And this idea that we would either watch someone who was quite loathsome raise themselves up to a status of relatability and redeemability, that was really the only good use of theater in his mind. Or to see the moral person begin to decline and spiral into a much lower position in life through their bad decisions and the cruelty they inflict on others. It was the fall from grace that was also acceptable. When you have a story like that, where you are watching somebody who has been so wronged take revenge in this very cruel way, that does sound like you're setting up villain territory versus anti-hero. An anti-hero, I think, is more that story arc of, you start from the low place and you get to the higher.
That's also what I would say is kind of like a distinction between an anti-hero and a villain, is that an anti-hero would have some kind of self-reflection, where a villain is completely confident in the horrible things that he's doing. An anti-hero questions what they're doing, saying, am I going too far? Is this too much? Am I going over the edge? I think once your character loses that, that's when they become a full-on villain.
Yeah, I think that's quite likely. The anti-hero might not necessarily be so reflective in the beginning, but at some point in an anti-hero story, there's a moment of reflection that I think leads to that point, where the villain is the hero of their own story, right? The villain believes that they are doing what they need to do to enact whatever it is they're trying to enact for their purpose of, messing with the hero, I guess. They are not going to be reflective. They are not going to stop and say, maybe I'm taking this too far, or maybe I shouldn't have done that last thing. Who am I? Like, that's not a villain's place.
So the same way I would kind of distill a hero down to the two core principles of admirability and relatability, I would distill like a villain down to the key characteristics of they need to be connected to the hero and they need to be committed to their cruelty. I think that is pretty much your starting point for your villain character. Obviously, it can get more complicated, but that's where you're going to start from.
Yeah, I think that, look, I've watched a lot of stories where a villain is definitely a villain and it's boring to watch because it's so formulaic. You do want some nuance in there, but in order for your villain to be a villain and not an anti-hero or some waffling in-between hybrid, yeah, I think they have to hit all those points.
出ましたキャンペーンクォーターモンタラバとエビのクリームグラタンピザとイタリア産モッツァレラたっぷりのモッツァイタリアーナが入った冬のキャンペーンクォーター4つの味で新発売うまっピザーラお届け
This week's question comes from the Autist Whisperer, and the Autist Whisperer writes, do you think art in manga is more important than the writing? I ask because I've seen recent criticisms towards One Punch Man, Kengan Ashura, and Platinum End for having a dip in quality when it comes to storytelling. Would that make you drop a series, or is the art enough to make you stick around? Thank you, Autist Whisperer, for sending in the question. I have not read Platinum End, and I am not up to date with One Punch Man or Kengan Ashura. So I would be interested to know what specifically are people criticizing? Like, what problems with the storytelling do people have specifically? Do they find it contrived? Do they find like the characters are acting out of step? Kengan Ashura and One Punch Man are action series. I mean, Kengan Ashura to me just feels like action porn. So being that both series are basically action series, if you're asking me my opinion, what would I do? If I was reading a manga series that was an action series and it was still delivering great action, I would still read that series even if there was a dip in storytelling. Especially One Punch Man, because I think One Punch Man is like the best action comic around. Yusuke Murata is my favorite working artist right now. I think the action sequences in One Punch Man are incredible. Murata does a great job in capturing the power of Saitama. Those panels feel like they're going to break under like the energy that his punches are releasing. The action sequences in One Punch Man explode with wild energy. I like the art in Kengan Ashura too. I think that art is done by Doramiyan. How do you say his name? Doramiyan. The fight sequences in Kengan Ashura actually remind me of, actually kind of feel like Fist of the North Star to me a bit. It's almost like Fist of the North Star mixed with MMA. The fights in the Kengan Ashura manga don't feel as flashy as the fights in the One Punch Man manga. Maybe that changes in later chapters, but at least the stuff that I've read, I don't feel like Kengan Ashura has the same kinetic energy as One Punch Man, but I do like the art in both series. A couple months back, I was watching that Disney Plus documentary on the Japanese Spider-Man, and one of the guys who worked on the show, he actually had this great observation about manga, where he was saying like, American comics are made to be read, but manga is made to be looked at. And that's definitely a simplification, but I think it definitely applies to comics like One Punch Man. One of the things I love about One Punch Man is that One Punch Man feels like a comic that you don't need to read. You could just look at it and the visuals tell the story. And I think one who writes One Punch Man is a good writer, and I think he purposefully writes One Punch Man to the strength of Murata. Because if you read Mob Psycho 100, there's a lot more dialogue in that, it's much more quippy, and one is letting Murata tell the story. Now on the flip side, there are comics like Death Note, which Death Note is not an action series, it's more of like a psychological thriller. And once again, the art in Death Note complements the story. The artwork in Death Note is not overly flashy, I wouldn't say it's minimalistic, but it's simple, it's realistic, and it doesn't distract from the narrative. So with that said, I would be much more willing to drop a series like Death Note if there was a dip in storytelling, because the storytelling is the reason I'm reading it. The artwork in Death Note for me is not the selling point. So really this question of art versus storytelling, what's more important, that's something you need to decide for yourself. You need to ask yourself, what am I getting out of this manga? And now that I come to think of it, I did have an instance where the writing of a series was so bad I stopped reading it. But it was a series I had read before. When I was a kid, I was a big fan of Michael Turner, and I read through all the issues of Witchblade. And, you know, it's been a while since I read them, so I was thinking of going back and rereading them, because I can't remember what the fuck happened in them. I just, you know. And so I was rereading the first 5 issues of Witchblade, and that comic is fucking terrible. It is so fucking terrible. It suffers from that problem that a lot of 90s comics have. They're just overwritten. There's so much fucking unnecessary dialogue and narration in those stories. And what makes it even crazier, when you look at the credits in the Witchblade trade, the fucking Witchblade story is credited to 5 fucking people. It took 5 people, 4 men and 1 woman, to come up with the idea of a naked chick who has a symbiote gauntlet. Witchblade is the product of the brain crunching of these great minds. Now, I've mentioned this before on Twitter, but I don't think I've ever mentioned it in a video. But I used to work at Marvel. I was a production artist at Marvel Comics. My claim to fame, this is completely true, I designed the 3 in Marvel Zombies 3. When I was working at Marvel, I ended up getting a lot of the rejected fan submissions. If you had sent Marvel a fan submission between like 2006 and 2010 and it was rejected, chances are it ended up on my desk. And those fan submissions were pretty entertaining. They weren't all badly written. Some of them were really fascinating. My favorite fan submission that was rejected was a fan submission where somehow Ant-Man got mixed up in the Thing's Cheerios, and then the Thing ate Ant-Man. And then the whole comic was Ant-Man trying to escape the rocky terrain that is the Thing's asshole. It was a fascinating, thoughtful journey about Ant-Man and the Thing's ass. The problem with a lot of those fan submissions is the same problem that I see in those early issues of Witchblade, which is that comic is so fucking overwritten. There's so much unnecessary exposition in that fucking comic because it just comes off as a person who is insecure about their writing and they need to prove to you that they're a great writer by just overwriting fucking everything. That's something that happens in Spawn comics too, like those early Todd McFarlane Spawn comics. Todd McFarlane is determined to convince you he's a good writer, so he's gonna overwrite the shit out of that fucking comic. Todd McFarlane in the 90s was obsessed with those news reporter panels in The Dark Knight Returns. Apparently that was something he must have loved about The Dark Knight because he's gonna do the same thing in Spawn. In those early Spawn comics, every other page will have like 5 panels dedicated to just newscasters talking about whatever. We're gonna hear what the fucking E! Channel has to say. We're gonna hear what CNN has to say. We're gonna hear what MTV has to say. We're gonna hear what every single fucking cable channel that existed in the 90s has to say about Spawn or Spawn-related matters. As if anybody gives a shit, but I digress. So, in answer to your question, I guess is it depends. It depends on what I'm reading the manga for. So, I want to thank the Autist Whisperer for sending me a question. And if you have a question and you'd like to send it to me, you could send me an email at studiochojin@gmail.com, and I would be happy to read it on a future edition of this show. Okay, so I just watched the Chainsaw Man trailer, and I'm going to give you my first thoughts. And my first thoughts is I think this looks pretty fucking awesome. I think MAPPA really fucking hit it out of the park. I think a lot of people were skeptical of MAPPA when they took over Attack on Titan from Wit Studio. But I think overall, I think they did a good job with Attack on Titan. I know some people aren't a fan of the 3D anime. I mean, it's definitely different from the earlier seasons, but certainly with the time jump and everything and the specific story arc that this season of Attack on Titan is tackling, I think the 3D animation style works really well. I had a lot of faith in MAPPA when they were announced to be the animation studio behind the Chainsaw Man anime. And I think this anime looks great. I mean, it looks like it's 2D. It doesn't really look... There are some shots that look like they're 3D, but overall it looks kind of like 2D. I mean, I guess... Or maybe it's just really good 3D that looks like 2D. I don't know. Either way, I think it looks really cool. I love that there's copious amounts of blood. I feel like the energy of the manga really comes across in the animation. I heard some people complaining about Makima's voice. I think they feel like her voice is too high. They feel like she should have a deeper voice. And spoilers, I guess before I go any further, if you haven't read Chainsaw Man, spoilers, because I'm going to start saying spoiler shit. I guess a lot of people wanted Makima to have a deeper voice because she's the control devil, but honestly, if you give her a fucking deep voice at the very start, it's going to be super obvious. That twist is going to be super obvious. So I could totally understand giving her a much higher voice. I like seeing Power. Power, I think, is my favorite character in Chainsaw Man. Power has the most boob scenes, and I really like the fact that Chainsaw Man delivers on boob action. What I like about Chainsaw Man is that it kind of feels like a mixture of Maximum Carnage and Devilman. Like, in a lot of ways, Chainsaw Man really is the modern Devilman. Even the way Denji becomes Chainsaw Man is very similar to the way Akira becomes Devilman, where they just shove him in a room with demons, and then in Chainsaw Man, Panchita has to merge with Denji, and in Devilman, Amon has to merge with Akira. And then Chainsaw Man has their own version of Siren with Bomb Girl. It's very cool. I like the fact that it's doing that classic comic book thing of kind of reintroducing these tropes that we know. And it's interesting too when you think about it, because there's a lot of Japanese like superhero manga coming out that have Western influence, you know, like My Hero Academia and One Punch Man, and even Chainsaw Man just feels like something that Image could have put out in the 90s. So yeah, I think this trailer looks very cool. I am looking forward to it. I was gonna do a video reviewing the first story arc of Chainsaw Man. I still might do that video, but in the meantime, I kind of put it on hold, and I think it might be kind of cool to do episode reviews of Chainsaw Man when it comes out. So I think I might do that. So with that said, those are my thoughts on Chainsaw Man. Those are my thoughts on art versus story, and those are my thoughts on the basics of a villain. So I hope you enjoyed this kind of potpourri episode of Raw, and this is Reverend Paul saying until we meet again.